as they're passing out the notes, I triple checked that there's no donuts in this PowerPoint. If you see one, I need help. Tonight we're looking at Obadiah, and I know I'm going through this. I just want to give an overview of these minor prophet books. We could spend forever. We spent 22 lessons looking at the life of one individual, Paul. Looking at 12 books, you could spend a long time, but just want to give you a snapshot of each book. Some of these books maybe you haven't really read through or even really know the content of what it's about. Some of these books, are not as prominent and as well known as some others, and we want to look at these and address these. And just want to give you an overall theme that I've put to this book. Doesn't mean that's the theme, but what I think stands out. And to me, it's this idea of sowing and reaping. This agricultural terminology that's so applicable for all things in life, and how what we see and read here can be pulled out and applied to a lot of things in life when it comes to us as individuals. In Obadiah, the very first verse, it tells us the vision of Obadiah. If we can know, it's always good to know the meaning of someone's name. Be curious, do you know the meaning of your name? What it means? Because names had tremendous significance, especially in the times that we're reading about in the minor prophets, in the time that they prophesied. The names that were given and what it signified and how it carried and paralleled with the mission that God had for them. Obadiah's name means servant of Yahweh. And there are several people in the Old Testament whose name is the same as this book, Obadiah. They are mentioned throughout various places in the Old Testament, particularly in the Kings, and Chronicles. But I don't think any of the Obadiah, in my opinion, any of the Obadiahs that are mentioned elsewhere are the exact Obadiah that the one that we're reading about, the vision came to, and that's writing this particular book. Obadiah and Micah are the only two of the minor prophet books and writers that we have no identification of their family origin or where they're from as far as location. Nothing said about that. And it's interesting because everyone else we have either or sometimes we have both. The date of the book of Obadiah, again, depending on the timing of this, could be 9th century BC, maybe to the latter part of the late century, 5th century rather, BC. I think towards that because of the destruction that's taking place with Jerusalem, in my opinion, I believe is the 586 BC when the Babylonians under the rule of Nebuchadnezzar come in and they conquer Jerusalem. I think that's the destruction that's being worded here of Edom and their behavior. That's my opinion. Obadiah is the shortest book in the Hebrew Bible. And this would be a good trivia question. There are 7 books in the Old Testament that are not quoted in the New Testament. All the other books, there's 39 books in the Old Testament. All the other books are quoted in the New Testament. 7 are not. Does anybody know the 7? For 100 bonus points? Anyone? I want to tell you the answer, but then I don't want to tell you the answer and see if you want to go find out and you tell me. But you can Google it, I guess. What are the 7 books that are not mentioned in the New Testament? It will pop right up there for you. No, the books are, obviously, Obadiah is not mentioned in the New Testament. Nahum is not. Ezra, our favorite, Nehemiah, and building up the walls, is not mentioned in the New Testament. Esther is not. Song of Solomon is not. And this is, to me, interesting. Ecclesiastes is not mentioned or quoted in the... Now, that's just a fun trivia fact. It means nothing. It may mean something, but it doesn't mean that they're not significant. It doesn't mean they're not important. It doesn't mean they shouldn't be a part of the catalog of the... It just is a fun fact. I thought you would enjoy that. The main message, though, of Obadiah is not really for God's people. It's those who are against God's people. We think of Jonah, that Jonah is an example of God sending Jonah to a Gentile city to prophesy against them. And that book is hovered around that. Obadiah is about a Gentile nation and God's message for them. Again, I made a mention of Amos in this theme, in this application, that God is the God of all the earth and of all nations, and He wasn't at this time just the God of Israel, and that was it. He was still God of heaven and earth. And even though Obadiah was a prophet of God, he had a message for this Gentile nation, that they had committed grievous sins against God's people, and it was time to face the consequences. But this would be also a message for God's people, a message of comfort to them, because they would get vindication from God and not from themselves. So again, 2 books in the minor prophets, Obadiah and next week, Lord willing, Jonah, both had a message to go not to God's people directly, but indirectly to what is God's people from a worldly standpoint, God loving the world, to Gentile nations. As I mentioned, I believe it is reaping what you sow, and we'll look at the verse there that really stands out to me in Obadiah that really points to that overall theme. The first, kind of up here before I go forward, you get a good sense of the split kingdoms. You have Judah and Israel, and then right below Judah is the kingdom of Edom. So neighbors, literally neighbors. And we'll see the origin of Edom going back to a story that takes place in Genesis, and seeing how they were involved and how the choices that were made, and then leading up to these consequences, okay? Point number 1 is this, how Edom was to be destroyed in verses 1 through 9. Edom's name means the red region, probably because of the geography and where it was located and the landscape at that time. The Edom was literally descendants of Esau. In fact, if you look in Genesis chapter 36 and verse 9, it says, "And this is the genealogy of Esau, the father of the Edomites, in Mount Seir." So this conflict between Edom and Israel, well, it began with Jacob and Esau. When Rebekah was, with children, with twins, that it was told to her that 2 nations are in your womb. And these 2 nations that would be Edom and as well as Israel would be at war and conflict ongoing for quite some time. Some of the details with that is in 1 Samuel chapter 14 and verse 47. Edom at this time refused to help the Israelites pass through their territory and to help King Saul as he was facing at the time some serious battles. In return, Saul battled Edom because of that. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it was David who conquered the territory of the Edomites at that time. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, it was Edom who joined forces of Moab and Ammon, that was their neighbors nearby in that map, in invading the southern kingdom of Judah. So, you have what you have today in that particular region of our world where it's been ongoing conflict since forever, since as time has existed and people have existed, going back and forth, having an edge, then the other person, whatever. God would bring them down to nothing. Look at verse 4 of Obadiah. Though you ascend as high as the eagle, though you set your nest among the stars, from there I will bring you down, says the Lord. When someone is as high as eagles and is feeling as high as stars, that's the very definition of what word? Pride. Pride goeth before the fall. Edom had become so prideful because of where they were at that present time, their location, strategically, their army, their particular wise people, and guiding them and counseling them, that they had a level about them that they felt invincible. And through the vision that Obadiah received, God informing Obadiah and informing Edom that it's from your high, lofty place that I'm going to bring you down. Who is? Israel? No, God is. God is. Some of the things that's pointed out here, if you look in verse 5, thieves would come in to rob, robbers by night. They'll cut you off. They will steal and they will take so much that they can't take everything. They leave things behind. Crop gatherers in that same verse will come and they won't have anything to pick from because probably it's been ruined, it is sour, it is not worth picking. And there goes the harvest. The Lord would destroy, in verses 8 and 9, their mighty men. Look at what it says in verse 8. Will I not in the days, says the Lord, even destroy the wise men from Edom and understanding from the mountains of Esau? Then your mighty men shall be dismayed. So the best of your best that you have won't stand a chance with what I will bring. I've underlined this in exclamation it several times. No one. That includes us as a country. No one is above punishment. No one. I love our country and I am glad to be here and so forth. But we have to say even America is not above punishment. Not from God. No one is. Yet we can get so fixated on, well, our military and our defense and our whatever, that we feel almost invincible, and we're not. No country is invincible. No person is invincible. We can be so fortified in our homes with our gates and our alarm system that our very own body fails us. What then? We're not invincible, and we're not above punishment. And I think that's a strong reminder for us, wherever we may be and wherever we may live, that we remember that pride does go before destruction, the fall and destruction. We need to always keep ourselves in check, and there's verse upon verse. Humble yourselves in the mighty hand of God. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. And how important that should be for all of us to live and be clothed, as Peter says, in humility. Point number 2 is this: why Edom was destroyed. I mentioned 1 in verse 3. They felt like that they were prideful. Listen what Edom had to say. The pride of your heart has deceived you. Verse 3, you will dwell in the cliffs of the rock, whose habitation is high. You who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Who's going to stop us? Who's going to bring us down from our safety net? That's what they thought, and they would be wrong. In verse 10, we see their other crime, their mistreatment towards their brother. For violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. Verse 15, for the day of the Lord is upon all the nations, is near. As you have done, it shall be done to you. You reprisals shall return upon your own head. As we think about that important statement and what it says there, Edom had failed in many ways to do what they should have done, and that is to help out their neighbor and their brother, but they did not do that. Their ties to their brotherhood should have led Edom to be a brother, as God said through Obadiah, your brother Jacob, when Israel came under attack, you did not help Israel out. You stood, you watched as the city became looted. As the people of Judah were taken into captivity, you rejoiced. Look at verse 12. But you should not have gazed on the day of your brother, in the day of his captivity, nor should you have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Nor should you have proudly spoken in the day of their distress. Again, I think the level of calamity that took upon Jerusalem at the time fits, I think, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC under King Nebuchadnezzar, and then being taken away into captivity. That day was a tragic day for Judah. As they were taken away to captivity, it was a day of misfortune. They were not the victor. They did not succeed, but let's be honest that even God's people were fair warned by many prophets, and they ignored and ignored and ignored. It was a day of destruction for God's people. It was a day of distress. But it was also a day where their neighbors were not being so neighborly by them rejoicing over their misfortune. I think that's so parallel, and that's going to come to our application, but just planting the seed a little bit ahead of the lesson, is we've got to be careful. You know, even Jesus says to pray for our enemies, those that despise us, those that, bless those who want to, that he's not suggesting, advocating in that dialogue in the to rejoice in our enemies' downfall and to speak reproach as misfortune falls upon them. The third point is this: when Edom would be destroyed, this day of the Lord, in quotes. Verse 15, you see it. For the day of the Lord is upon all the nation is near. The day of the Lord refers to two aspects of God in a specific event. Either he's going to deliver someone or something, or he is going to destroy. And both of those, we see that here in the book of Obadiah. Verse 15, the day of the Lord would be destruction for Edom and all the nations that were near. But it would also be in verses 17 through 21, a day of deliverance for the people of God or Judah. Look at verse 15 again, that phrase that's mentioned there. Maybe it's ahead. Yes. As you have done, it will be done to you. Kind of what you reap, you sow. That's basically what that is saying to me. What Edom and these other nations, how they had treated their neighbor, and how poorly they were as a neighbor, that the same would be done to them. In Galatians chapter 6 and in verse 7, we're reminded by Paul that whatever a person, or we could say whatever a nation sows, he or a nation will reap. Galatians chapter 6 and in verse 7. Kind of what goes around comes back around sometimes, doesn't it? Sometimes we think that what is done won't come back, but sometimes it does. And that is the principle based on what we sow. And again, Paul is using that to point out that being careful what we are sowing to, that we are sowing of the Spirit and not to the flesh. Because if we do that, then it's what we're going to reap. The consequences, whether good or bad, from it. And so it would be the destruction of Edom. It would come upon them. If you go back and look at verse 10, that they will be cut off forever. That God would bring them down from up on high in their safety place, their place of sanctuary, of a fortified place that they thought. It would not stop them from God and His destructive path because of how they behaved and how they have treated and what they have done. And God wanted Edom to be prepared and know in advance what was going to happen and who was going to be responsible for when it did happen. It would be the Lord. As Edom drank from God's holy mountain, Edom would be forced to drink from His cup of suffering. And the other nations as well that participated would also take part in this cup of suffering, of punishment. And Edom would be as if they never existed. Think about that. God has the ability and the power to do that. God is more than able and capable of doing that. And the day of the Lord was in that way, in verse 15 and following, for Edom and these other nations. It would be a day where God, an event of God, where He would destroy. But the day of the Lord is not always seen in a negative light. It's not always seen as punishment. It's not always seen as gloom and doom for someone, whoever it pertains to. It can also refer to an event where God is directly involved in delivering, saving. And that's what would happen to God's people. It would be a day of the Lord where God will intervene and help His people. And that begins in verse 17 through the rest of this book in verse 21. How God would intervene. Look at the very beginning. But on Mount Zion there shall be deliverance. There shall be holiness. The house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. As you read these verses, this day of the Lord for them, for Judah, this day of deliverance, is two things that would happen. Number one is this: worship would be restored. Temple worship. Those who've been taken to captivity, those where the temple had been ransacked, property of God had been stolen, taken as plunder, if you will, loot, if you will, from those invading. It would be restored back to where it needed to be, focused on God and worshiping. That's the first important thing. Secondly is the land itself. After a nation goes through ransacking, burning, taking, the land needs to heal. The land needs to come back, and that takes time. And the land would be restored there in Zion, in Mount Zion, which is Jerusalem, in the land of Judah. God's people will again be united as one. Look at verse 18. The house of Jacob shall be on fire, and the house of Joseph aflame, but the house of Esau shall be kindled them and devour them, and no survivor shall remain in the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. The south shall possess, and all the captives of the host of the children of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites. And so you see here this regroup and this coming together and bringing together God's people in the place that God had provided for them. The very last verse of Obadiah is this: then deliverers shall come to Mount Zion to judge the mountains of Esau, and the kingdom shall be of the Lord's. Again, the Jews would return back to their city. They would return back to their land, to their homes. They would return back to their temple. They would return back to their leaders ascending upon Mount Zion into Jerusalem. And more importantly, God's sovereignty would be recognized ever more so by His people. You see, it's over time where we can lose that and forget that and look to ourselves and look at our own strength and our own minds and our own ability and our own ingenuity and say to ourselves, look what I have done and look what I can do, and not think about God and rely on Him. Aren't we reminded, even in the Old, especially the New as well, lean not on your own understanding. In all ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your path. He would be seen, God would be seen ruler of all. And Edom would be destroyed and Judah would be blessed. Now it's interesting, isn't it? Obadiah is a message about God paying, delivering, or maybe I should say destroying, another nation. What message is that to God's people of that day? What could they take from this? One is encouragement, I believe. They could be encouraged. They can be encouraged that their problem, their adversary, was going to be handled not by them but by God and would be taken care of. They could also be encouraged by Obadiah's message from God that God makes things right. God makes things right. Oh, I don't know if you've ever done this or not. You try to fix something, and when you try to fix something, it got much worse. I'm like that with maybe a good portion of household chores and problems. I can sometimes nail it, and sometimes I make it worse. My wife always holds her breath. Let me try it and see. But in other problems, we can do that as well. In people problems, we can do that as well. We think we can help. We can try to help, but we probably did the opposite of that. I think another lesson is God is the God over all nations. I'm not just located, I'm not just limited in this area, and I don't cross this line. He's the God of all the earth. He's the God who made the earth. He's the God of heaven. He's the God of the galaxies and stars and everything that we possibly know and have explored and even understand. And even more so, He's the God of all these things. I think also this, an encouragement: mistreating God's people is a fight against God. It's a fight against God. We are His people. And the importance of that. Well, what are some things for us as Christians? What are some applications? I mentioned in the lesson in our devotional hour, don't be a bystander. A bystander. With someone, you tell these with your children, with kids, if someone is being picked, don't be a bystander. Help someone else out. Edom was not a brother, or not acting as a brother, when Jerusalem was being overtaken by an enemy. And again, Jesus spoke about being a neighbor. Instead of going around and asking, hey, are you my neighbor? Are you my neighbor? Be a neighbor to someone. Be that neighbor. And it begs the question for us, do we pass by on the other side by being a bystander? Well, it's not my problem. I didn't do that. I didn't cause that. Another thing that I think stands out goes back to that what is mentioned, that as they had done, so would be done back to them. What goes around comes back around. What you sow, you reap. Edom had watched, they had looked, they had rejoiced when God's people were being destroyed. They had believed in so much in themselves that they were invincible. Who could bring us down from here? Who can? That's a rhetorical. They didn't believe anyone could. And their sins came back on them. In other words, what we've been talking about, what we just finished in the month of August, Edom was accountable to God, weren't they? And every nation on earth in our world today is accountable to God, including our own nation. We as individuals are accountable to God to give an account of what we have done while in the body here, whether good or bad. And last is this: no one is above punishment. No one. I don't care how big of a job they have. I don't care how much money they make. I don't care how much stuff they have. No one is above punishment. No one is. Not when it comes to our standing with God. Interesting, 21 verses and that's it. I don't know if you've ever read through Obadiah. Maybe you did in reading the Bible a year and you read right through it and didn't really pay much attention to it. But maybe this just kind of brings you back to it, because even in this shortest book of the Hebrew Bible, there is an important lessons, even for us today, to consider and to reflect upon. No, there's no Edoms, and there's none of the Ammons or the Moabs. But there is us as God's people and His representatives, and we are His ambassadors. And it comes down to it, as I mentioned earlier, we should be neighborly as best as we can. I love Romans 12, verse, I believe, 19. As much as depends upon you, live peaceably among all. That's all I have. Next week, I heard from last night from our youngest son. We said, what's your favorite story in the Bible? And he said currently it's David and Goliath, but he said before that one, his very first favorite story in the Bible was Jonah. And he said it the best. What we don't know if it's a whale, it was a great fish. And that's so true. Jonah and the great fish. We will look at that, Lord willing, next Wednesday. Let's pray. Father God, we are grateful and thankful for your word. It's so rich. It's so deep in knowledge and understanding. And we could just look at something like the Book of Obadiah we can flip through our Bibles and easily pass over it. But it has so much information and so much history and so many lessons then and even for us today.